The rain turned the castle steps into a black mirror, reflecting nothing but Mara's desperation. Her fingers clutched the iron gate, knuckles white against the dark metal, dress soaked through and clinging to her shaking frame. Blood ran from a cut above her eyebrow, mixing with rainwater, painting pink streaks down her cheek. She had 3 copper coins in her pocket, no family within 200 miles, and perhaps 15 minutes before Lord Brennan's guards found her. The Vampire King's castle rose before her like a mountain of stone and shadow, every window dark except one at the very top, where a single candle burned like a distant star. They said King Theron never granted audiences to humans. They said he'd ruled for 3 centuries without mercy, that his court was ice and his judgments were iron. They said a lot of things in the village, most of them designed to keep poor girls like Mara from bothering the powerful. But Mara had nowhere else to run. She pulled the bell rope with trembling hands. The sound echoed through the courtyard, deep and resonant, like the tolling of a funeral bell. For a long moment, nothing happened. Rain drummed against the cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, she heard dogs barking. Lord Brennan's hunting dogs. Her breath came in sharp gasps, panic clawing at her throat. She pulled the bell again, harder this time, desperate. Please. Please. The gate didn't open. Instead, a voice came from directly behind her, quiet and cold as winter wind. Why are you bleeding on my doorstep? Mara spun around so fast she nearly fell. A man stood 3 paces away, though she hadn't heard him approach. No, not a man. King Theron. She'd never seen him up close before. He was tall, impossibly tall, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes the color of smoke. He wore black even in the rain, a long coat that didn't seem to get wet, and his face could have been carved from marble for all the warmth it showed. Everything about him whispered danger. Everything except his hands, which hung loose at his sides, empty and still. Mara's knees buckled. She hit the wet stone, her dress pooling around her like spilled ink. "Your Majesty," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Please, I need sanctuary, just for tonight. Please." The king's expression didn't change. He looked at her, the way someone might look at a puzzle they hadn't decided whether to solve or discard. "Who's hunting you?" "Lord Brennan." Mara's hands fisted in her wet skirt. "I was his daughter's nanny for 2 years. He tried to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Her throat closed around the words. "When I refused, he said he'd kill me. Said no one would believe a servant over a lord. Said," she started crying then, hard, shaking sobs that hurt her ribs. The king watched her cry with the same unchanged expression, as if emotion was a foreign language he'd forgotten how to read. The rain fell harder. In the distance, the dogs sounded closer. Mara forced herself to look up at him, through the water streaming down her face. "I can work. I'm good with children. I can clean, cook, anything you need. I just need one night. Just tonight, and tomorrow I'll—" She didn't know how to finish that either. Tomorrow she'd have nothing and nowhere, but tomorrow felt impossibly far away. King Theron tilted his head slightly, studying her. "What's your name?" "Mara, Your Majesty. Mara Ashton. Mara Ashton." He repeated it slowly, as if testing the shape of it. "How old are you?" 23, sire. And you've been caring for Brennan's daughter since you were 21? "Yes, Your Majesty. Since Lady Charlotte was born. She's 2 now." She paused, then added in a whisper, "She called me Mama. The real Lady Brennan died in childbirth, and the little girl doesn't remember her." Something flickered across the king's face, too quick to name. He looked past Mara toward the road, where torchlight was beginning to appear through the trees. Then he looked back at her, his smoke-colored eyes unreadable. "Stand up." Mara struggled to her feet, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stay upright. The king stepped closer. He moved like water, smooth and inevitable, and suddenly he was right in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine stitching on his coat, close enough to realize he wasn't breathing the way humans breathe. His hand came up, and Mara flinched. But he didn't strike her. His fingers touched her chin, tilting her face toward the light spilling from the castle windows. He examined the cut on her forehead with the clinical detachment of someone assessing damaged property. Did he do this? Yes. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Anything else? Mara hesitated. The king's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something in them besides cold assessment. Patience, maybe. Or something older and more complicated. My ribs, she whispered. He kicked me when I tried to leave. Show me. Mara's hands shook as she pulled aside the torn neckline of her dress, revealing the massive purple bruise spreading across her left side. The king's expression went very still. Then he dropped his hand and stepped back. You'll sleep in the East Wing tonight, he said, his voice perfectly level. Tomorrow, we'll discuss more permanent arrangements. Relief hit Mara so hard she nearly collapsed again. Thank you. Thank you, Your Majesty. The king held up one hand, cutting her off. Don't thank me yet. He turned and walked toward the castle gates, which swung open at his approach as if they'd been waiting. Mara followed on unsteady legs, too grateful and too terrified to do anything else. As she passed through the gates, she heard the dogs reach the castle wall, heard men's voices shouting, but the gates closed behind her with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and the sounds from outside became muffled, distant, unimportant. Inside the courtyard, out of the rain, Mara finally let herself believe she might survive the night. The castle interior smelled of beeswax and old stone, the kind of smell that spoke of centuries passing in silence. Mara's wet shoes squeaked against marble floors, so polished they reflected the candlelight, like still water. King Theron walked ahead of her, his footsteps making no sound at all, and she had to half-run to keep up with his long strides. They passed through hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced vampires in ancient clothing, through rooms filled with furniture draped in white cloth like sleeping ghosts. The castle felt empty, not just quiet, but abandoned, as if no one had lived in these rooms for years. No servants appeared. No guards stood at doorways. Just endless corridors and closed doors, and the king's silent figure leading her deeper into the labyrinth. Finally, he stopped before a set of double doors, carved with intricate roses. The East Wing, he said, pushing them open. Your room is the third door on the left. There's a bathroom adjoining. You'll find dry clothes in the wardrobe. Mara stepped into the hallway beyond, which was narrower than the grand corridors they'd passed through, more intimate. Lived in, somehow, despite the silence. Thank you, Your Majesty, she said quietly. I don't know how to repay. The king's expression stopped her mid-sentence. You said you're good with children. Yes, sire. I've cared for Lady Charlotte since she was born. Before that, I helped raise my younger siblings. I know how to manage tantrums, teach manners, handle night terrors, everything. The king was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I have a daughter. She's 4 years old. Her name is Celeste. Mara's surprise must have shown on her face because the king's mouth tightened slightly. Yes, vampires can have children. It's rare, but possible. Celeste's mother died when she was an infant. Since then, I've employed 7 nannies. None lasted more than 3 months. Why not? They were frightened. The king's voice was perfectly flat. Of me, of the castle, of raising a vampire child. They left in the night without notice, and Celeste learned that everyone abandons her eventually. Now she won't speak. Won't eat properly. Won't sleep through the night. Won't let anyone touch her except me. And he paused, and for the first time Mara heard something almost like uncertainty in his voice. I don't know how to reach her anymore. Everything I do seems to make it worse. Mara's heart, which had been hammering with fear since she fled Lord Brennan's estate, suddenly ached for a completely different reason. She thought of Charlotte, who'd clung to her skirts and called her Mama. Thought of how children learn to build walls when the world hurt them. How long has she been like this? 6 months, since the last nanny left. The king looked at Mara with those smoke-colored eyes, and she saw exhaustion in them now. Not physical tiredness. Vampires probably didn't feel that. But something deeper. The weariness of someone who'd been failing at something important for too long. I need someone who won't leave, he said quietly. Someone who understands that children need consistency more than they need perfection. Someone who, he stopped himself. Tomorrow morning, if you're still willing, I'll introduce you to Celeste. If she accepts you, the position is yours. Room, board, salary, and protection from anyone who might wish you harm. If she doesn't accept you, I'll ensure you have safe passage to wherever you wish to go and enough money to start over. Mara's mind spun. An hour ago, she'd been running for her life. Now, a vampire king was offering her employment, safety, and a purpose. It felt too good to be real, like a dream that would shatter when she woke. But the cut on her forehead throbbed, her ribs ached, and King Theron was still standing there waiting for her answer. I won't leave her, Mara said, and meant it, even if she doesn't accept me at first. Children who've been hurt need time to learn trust again. I know that. I won't abandon her. The king studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was lying. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. Third door on the left. Rest tonight. Tomorrow will be difficult. He turned to leave, then paused. Mara. Yes, your majesty. If you try to harm my daughter, I will kill you myself. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered in the same tone someone might use to mention the weather. Mara should have been terrified. Instead, she felt oddly reassured. A father who loved his child enough to threaten murder was a father who would protect that child fiercely. I would never hurt a child, she said quietly. I know what it's like to be hurt by people who should protect you. That's why I'm here. Something shifted in the king's expression, softening by the smallest degree. He nodded again and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the end of the hallway. Mara stood alone in the silence, dripping rainwater onto ancient floors, and wondered what kind of child could frighten away 7 nannies. The room behind the third door was larger than the entire cottage Mara had grown up in. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, draped in deep blue fabric that looked like captured twilight. A fireplace held fresh logs ready to light. The wardrobe the king had mentioned stood against one wall, and when Mara opened it, she found dresses in her size, soft cotton nightgowns, and even slippers. As if he'd known she was coming. As if this room had been waiting for someone. She peeled off her wet clothes with shaking hands, her bruised ribs protesting every movement. In the adjoining bathroom, she found a copper tub, soap that smelled of lavender, and thick towels. She ran a bath, sinking into the hot water with a gasp of relief and pain. The cut on her forehead stung. Her ribs throbbed. But she was warm. She was safe. And she was alive. That was more than she'd dared hope for 3 hours ago. As she scrubbed away the blood and rain and terror, Mara thought about King Theron's daughter, 4 years old and silent. A child who'd learned that people leave. Mara knew that lesson intimately. Her own mother had died when she was 6. Her father had remarried a woman who saw Mara as a burden. By the time she was 15, she'd left home to find work, sending money back for her younger siblings, and trying not to think about how easily she'd been let go. Children needed consistency. The king was right about that. They needed someone who stayed even when things were hard. Someone who saw them, really saw them, and didn't turn away. Mara woke to sunlight streaming through windows she didn't remember opening. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in Lord Brennan's estate, that the previous night had been a fever dream. Then she moved, her ribs screamed in protest, and memory crashed back. She was in King Theron's castle. She was safe. She had a chance at a new life if she could connect with a traumatized 4-year-old who'd already learned not to trust. A soft knock sounded at her door. Mara sat up carefully, pulling the borrowed nightgown around her shoulders. "Come in." The door opened to reveal a woman who looked about 60, though with vampires Mara could never be sure. She wore a simple gray dress and carried a tray laden with breakfast, bread and cheese, and fruit and tea that steamed in the morning air. "Good morning, miss," the woman said, her voice warm in a way Mara hadn't expected. "I'm Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper. His Majesty asked me to bring you breakfast and help you dress." "There are other staff here?" Mara asked, surprised. The castle had seemed so empty last night. "Just 3 of us," Mrs. Hendricks said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "Myself, old Thomas, who manages the grounds, and Marie, who cooks. His Majesty doesn't like crowds, prefers his privacy." She pulled open the wardrobe and began selecting clothing with practiced efficiency. "But he told me this morning we'd be having a new nanny for Lady Celeste, and I must say, it's about time. That poor child needs someone steady." "The previous nannies," Mara started, then wasn't sure how to finish. Mrs. Hendricks's expression tightened. "Cowards. Every one of them." "Oh, they had their reasons." "The castle is remote. His Majesty can be frightening if you don't know him. And Lady Celeste is," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "challenging. But a child in pain needs patience, not abandonment." She laid out a simple dress in deep green, practical, but well made. "Now eat your breakfast. His Majesty wants to introduce you to Lady Celeste within the hour, and you'll need your strength." The food was better than anything Mara had eaten in months. She forced herself to eat slowly, even though her stomach wanted to devour everything at once. As she ate, Mrs. Hendricks helped her into the dress, braided her hair, and covered the cut on her forehead with a light bandage. "You're very kind," Mara said quietly. Mrs. Hendricks smiled, the expression creasing her weathered face into something almost motherly. "I like you already. You've got sad eyes but brave hands. That's what Lady Celeste needs. Someone who understands hurt, but doesn't drown in it." She stepped back, examining Mara critically. "There. You look like someone a child could trust. Not too formal, not too ragged. Just right." A soft bell chimed somewhere in the castle, 3 clear notes. "That's His Majesty," Mrs. Hendricks said. "He's in the nursery. 3rd floor, West Tower. I'll walk you there." The castle looked different in daylight. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating details Mara had missed in the darkness. Tapestries showing ancient forests, mosaics of stars across cathedral ceilings, and everywhere, books, shelves and shelves of books lining corridors like the castle itself was a library that happened to have rooms attached. They climbed a spiral staircase that wound upward through the West Tower. As they rose, Mara heard singing, a man's voice, deep and surprisingly gentle, singing a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize. Mrs. Hendricks paused on the stairs, listening. "That's His Majesty," she said softly. "He sings to her every morning. She won't respond, but he keeps trying. Says his mother used to sing that song to him back when he was young. Before he became, She gestured vaguely. This. They reached a door painted with clouds and birds, whimsical and bright against the dark stone walls. Mrs. Hendricks knocked gently. The singing stopped. "Come in." King Theron's voice was different than it had been last night, softer somehow, despite the command. Mrs. Hendricks opened the door and gestured for Mara to enter. The nursery was a revelation. While the rest of the castle felt ancient and formal, this room exploded with color. Painted murals covered every wall, showing gardens full of impossible flowers, forests where animals wore crowns, and skies where stars formed pictures of dancing children. Toys overflowed from carved chests. Books lay scattered across a thick carpet. And in the center of it all, sitting in a rocking chair with a small figure curled in his lap, was King Theron. He looked different in daylight, less like a marble statue, and more like a tired father holding a child who wouldn't look at him. Lady Celeste had dark curls that fell past her shoulders, and skin so pale it seemed translucent. She wore a white nightgown embroidered with silver stars, and her small body was rigid against her father's chest, tolerating the embrace but not softening into it. Her eyes were fixed on the wall, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. "Celeste," the king said quietly, "there's someone I want you to meet. Her name is Mara, and she'd like to be your friend." The child didn't react, didn't turn her head, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge that anyone had spoken. Mara's heart broke a little. She'd seen this before, with Charlotte after a particularly bad night, when Lord Brennan had screamed at the servants. That same frozen stillness, that retreat into a place where words couldn't reach. She stepped forward slowly, making sure her footsteps were audible, and knelt on the carpet several feet away from the rocking chair. She didn't try to make eye contact with Celeste. Instead, she looked at the painted walls. "These murals are beautiful," she said conversationally, as if speaking to the room itself rather than anyone in particular. "I especially love the garden with the purple roses. I've never seen purple roses in real life. I wonder if they exist somewhere." Silence. The king watched her with unreadable eyes. Mara continued, her voice gentle. "When I was little, I used to imagine a garden where every flower was a different color from normal. Blue sunflowers and green tulips and roses in every shade of purple and silver. My little brother said I was silly, that flowers had to be their proper colors, or they wouldn't be real. But I thought," she smiled at the memory, "if magic exists, surely magical flowers could be any color they wanted." Still nothing from Celeste. Mara shifted slightly, still not looking directly at the child, and noticed a book lying open near her knee. Its pages showed illustrations of a girl with a red cloak walking through a forest. "Oh," she said softly, picking up the book. "I know this story. Little Red Riding Hood. My brother loved this one, though he always said the wolf should win because wolves need to eat too. He had a strange sense of justice, the tiniest movement." Celeste's head turned, just a fraction, just enough that Mara could see her profile. The little girl's eyes were the same smoke gray as her father's, and they fixed on the book with intensity. Mara pretended not to notice. She opened the book to the first page and began reading aloud, not in the dramatic voice adults often use with children, but in her normal tone, as if telling a story to a friend. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who loved the color red more than any other color in the world. She read slowly, turning pages with care, occasionally pausing to examine an illustration more closely. When she reached the part where Red Riding Hood meets the wolf, she heard a small sound. A breath, sharp and quick. She glanced up without thinking. Celeste was looking at her now, truly looking, those gray eyes wide and wary but unmistakably focused. Their gazes met for just a second, before Celeste looked away. But that second felt like victory. Mara continued reading, her voice steady. The wolf asked, "Where are you going, little girl?" And Red Riding Hood, who'd been taught to be polite, told him everything. Another small sound, this one almost like a scoff. Mara looked up again, questioning. Celeste's small hand moved slightly, pointing at the picture of Red Riding Hood talking to the wolf. Her expression said clearly what her voice wouldn't. "That was stupid." Mara smiled. "You're right. That was pretty silly of her. My brother always said the same thing. Never tell strangers where you're going, especially strangers with big teeth." Celeste's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Mara finished the story, and when she closed the book, she set it down gently on the carpet between herself and the chair. She didn't try to move closer, didn't reach out, just stayed where she was, available but not intrusive. "Thank you for letting me read to you," she said quietly. "I like that story, even though Red Riding Hood makes questionable choices." King Theron's voice broke the spell. "Celeste, are you hungry? Would you like breakfast?" The little girl's body went rigid again. She turned her face into her father's chest, hiding, and the moment of connection shattered like dropped glass. The king's expression flickered with old pain, quickly suppressed. He looked at Mara. "She usually eats in here, prefers it. I'll stay with her if Mara had an idea." She spoke carefully, addressing her words to the air rather than directly to either of them. "When I was young and sad, I used to eat breakfast in my favorite hiding spot. There was an oak tree near our cottage with branches that made a perfect little room. I'd bring bread and honey up there and pretend I was a bird having breakfast in my nest." Silence. Then, so quietly Mara almost missed it, a small voice. "Where?" Mara's heart jumped, but she kept her expression calm. Where was my tree? Or where was my hiding spot in the branches? "In the tree," the small voice repeated. It was high-pitched and rusty, like an instrument that hadn't been played in months. The second big branch. There was a place where 3 smaller branches met, and they made a little bowl shape, just big enough for a small person. King Theron had gone very still. His hand on his daughter's back stopped moving, frozen mid-stroke. Celeste pulled away from his chest slightly and looked at Mara with those solemn gray eyes. "Do you have a tree here?" she asked. Her words were careful, shaped precisely, as if she was remembering how to use them. "I don't know," Mara admitted. "I only arrived last night. But I'd like to find out. Would you want to help me look? After breakfast?" Celeste considered this. Then she looked up at her father, a question in her eyes. The king's voice was rough. "If you'd like to, little star. We could look together." The little girl thought for another moment, then nodded once. "But," she said, looking back at Mara, "not in here." "Breakfast outside?" Celeste nodded again. "By the window. The morning room has large windows," King Theron said, his tone carefully neutral, though Mara could hear the hope underneath. "We could have breakfast there. All of us." Celeste's hand clutched her father's shirt, considering. Then she whispered, "Okay." The morning room was on the 2nd floor, wrapped in windows that overlooked the castle gardens. Someone had already set the table, white cloth and silver and plates painted with delicate flowers. Mrs. Hendricks appeared with food, bread and eggs, and fresh fruit and sweet, pastries dusted with sugar. Celeste sat in a high-backed chair that made her look even smaller, her father on one side and Mara on the other. She didn't eat at first, just stared at her plate with that same frozen stillness. Mara picked up her fork and began eating, making quiet comments to King Theron about the excellent food, the beautiful view, the way the morning light made the garden look like something from a painting. She didn't look at Celeste, didn't prompt her, just created a space where eating felt normal and unstressed. After a few minutes, Celeste picked up a piece of bread. She took a tiny bite, chewed carefully, and swallowed. Then another bite. Then she reached for a strawberry. King Theron's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his teacup. He'd probably given up hope of seeing his daughter eat normally, probably spent months watching her refuse food, forcing himself to be patient while his heart broke. Mara caught his eye across the table and smiled slightly. He didn't smile back, but something in his expression softened. After breakfast, true to her promise, Mara stood by the windows and looked out at the gardens. "I don't see any oak trees," she said thoughtfully, "but there are some beautiful willows near the pond, and that huge pine tree by the eastern wall. Do you think any of them have good hiding spots?" Celeste had climbed down from her chair and now stood beside Mara, her small hand gripping the windowsill. She was so tiny, barely reaching Mara's waist. "The willow," she whispered, pointing. "Branches go all the way down. You could hide inside. Like a tent." "Exactly like a tent," Mara agreed. "Shall we go see?" Celeste looked uncertain. Then she looked at her father. King Theron rose from his chair, elegant and fluid. "I would very much like to explore hiding spots in willow trees." He offered his hand to his daughter. Celeste took it, then surprised everyone by reaching out her other hand to Mara. They walked through the gardens like an unlikely family, the vampire king in his formal black coat, the small, pale child between them, and Mara in her borrowed green dress. Celeste didn't speak as they walked, but her hand stayed in Mara's, warm and trusting in a way that felt like a gift. The willow tree was ancient, its branches cascading down like a waterfall of green leaves. Celeste was right. Stepping through the curtain of branches felt like entering a secret room. Inside, the world turned soft and filtered, sunlight dappling through leaves, the sound of wind muffled and distant. "It's perfect," Mara breathed, "like being underwater, but you can still breathe." Celeste let go of their hands and walked to the trunk, running her small fingers over the rough bark. "My mother planted this tree," King Theron said quietly, "when Celeste was born. She said every child should have a tree that grows with them." Mara looked at him. His expression was carefully neutral, but she heard the grief underneath his words. 4 years wasn't long enough to stop missing someone. An eternity wasn't long enough. "Do you remember her?" Mara asked Celeste gently. The little girl shook her head, still tracing patterns on the bark. "Daddy tells me stories, but I don't remember." Her voice was so small, it nearly disappeared in the rustling leaves. "What kind of stories?" Mara asked. Celeste looked at her father, a clear prompt. King Theron settled against the willow's trunk, his long legs folding elegantly. He gestured for them to sit, and they did, Celeste immediately climbing into his lap, Mara sitting nearby on the soft grass. "Your mother," the king began, "loved music. She could play 7 instruments, but her favorite was the violin. When she played, birds would stop flying just to listen. She'd stand on the balcony at sunset and play for the whole valley, and everyone within 5 miles would pause whatever they were doing to hear." He spoke slowly, painting pictures with words. "She had hair like midnight with stars caught in it, and when she laughed, it sounded like bells. She collected things, odd things, interesting rocks, old keys, feathers from rare birds. Our room was full of tiny treasures she'd found, each one with a story." Celeste leaned back against his chest, listening with those serious gray eyes. Mara watched them both, seeing the way the king's hands cradled his daughter, the way his voice gentled when speaking about his dead wife. "Did she like gardens?" Mara asked. The king smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger, more human. She loved them. Spent hours designing these gardens, choosing every flower and tree with intention. She said a garden should tell a story, that each plant should have meaning. See those white roses by the eastern wall? Those were for purity. The lavender near the gate for devotion. And this willow, he touched the tree trunk, for peace and protection. Celeste reached up and touched her father's face, her small hand patting his cheek. Tell the birthday story. His expression flickered. That one? Yes. The king settled more comfortably, adjusting Celeste in his arms. Your mother insisted on celebrating birthdays properly, not just a cake and gifts, but an entire day dedicated to making someone feel special. When it was my birthday, the year before you were born, she filled the castle with candles, thousands of them. Every room, every hallway, every corner had candlelight. She said vampires were creatures of night, so she'd bring the stars inside for me. Celeste smiled, a real smile that lit up her small face. And she made you dance. The king's mouth twitched. She did. Made me dance in the ballroom with her, just the two of us. I kept stepping on her toes because I'm better with swords than waltzes, but she laughed and said I was improving. We danced until dawn, and when the sun started rising, she said it was the best birthday gift to see the night end and know I'd survived another year. His voice had gone rough, that I'd be there for another year, that we had more time. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of loss settling over them like the dappled sunlight. Then Celeste spoke, her voice very small. Daddy cries sometimes. At night. When he thinks I'm sleeping. The king's arms tightened around her. I'm sorry, little star. I try not to. It's okay, Celeste interrupted. I cry too. Mara's throat felt tight. She looked away, giving them privacy, focusing on the patterns of light on grass. Do you know what my brother taught me? She said after a moment. When we missed our mother? She didn't wait for an answer, just continued quietly. He said that people we love never really leave us. They live in the things we do, the ways we think, the kindness we show. Every time I braid someone's hair, I'm remembering my mother teaching me to braid. Every time I sing a lullaby, she's there. Every time I'm kind to someone who needs help, I'm carrying her forward. Celeste turned to look at her. So your mama is still here? In a way, Mara said. In the way that matters. The little girl thought about this. Then she looked at her father. Is Mama in the garden? King Theron's eyes were bright. Yes. Every flower, every tree, every beautiful thing growing here. She's in all of it. And Celeste's hand went to her chest. In here? In your heart? The king nodded, not trusting his voice. Celeste seemed satisfied with this. She settled back against her father and looked at Mara. Will you stay? Or will you leave like the others? Mara met those serious gray eyes, so much older than 4 years should hold. I'll stay, she promised, as long as you want me here. Even if I'm difficult, even then. What if I don't talk for a whole day? Then we'll have a quiet day together. What if I'm sad and angry and mean? Then I'll sit with you until the sad and angry pass. I won't leave just because things are hard. The little girl studied her face, searching for lies. Mara let her look, keeping her expression open and honest. Finally, Celeste nodded. Some decision made. Okay, you can be my person, but not my mother. I already have a mother. She's in the garden and in my heart. Of course, Mara agreed. I'll be your friend, your helper, your person who stays. Celeste seemed to find this acceptable. She yawned, the excitement and emotion of the morning catching up with her. King Theron stood smoothly, lifting her with him. Nap time, little star. No protests. The child didn't protest, just nestled against his shoulder, but she kept her eyes on Mara as they left the willow's shelter. "Will you read me another story after my nap?" "As many stories as you want," Mara promised. They walked back to the castle together, and for the first time since arriving, Mara felt like maybe this could work. Maybe she could build something here. Maybe they all could. The first week passed in a careful dance of trust building. Celeste didn't speak much, but when she did, it was usually to Mara. Small comments about her toys, questions about stories, observations about the weather. The king watched these interactions with an intensity that might have been frightening if Mara didn't recognize it for what it was: desperate hope. He'd begun joining them for meals, for story time, for walks in the garden, slowly learning his daughter's new rhythms, the ways she was emerging from her shell. On the 8th day, Mrs. Hendricks found Mara in the library, where she'd been reading while Celeste napped. The housekeeper's face was troubled. "There's a gentleman at the gate," she said quietly. "Lord Brennan. He's demanding to speak with His Majesty. Says he's here to retrieve stolen property." Mara's blood went cold. "I'm not property." "I know that, dear. But he's making quite a scene. His Majesty is handling it. But I thought you should know." Mara stood, her hands shaking. "Where are they?" "The front courtyard. But perhaps you shouldn't." Mara was already moving. She couldn't hide while someone fought her battles. Couldn't let King Theron handle this alone, when it was her mess, her past, her problem. The front courtyard was flooded with afternoon sunlight. Lord Brennan stood near the gates, flanked by 4 guards in his house colors. He was a large man, red-faced and prosperous, wearing fine clothes and an expression of righteous indignation. King Theron stood on the castle steps, a dark figure against pale stone. The contrast between them was striking. Lord Brennan looked like daylight and commerce, loud and immediate. The Vampire King looked like midnight and old magic, quiet and eternal. "You harbor a criminal, Your Majesty," Lord Brennan was saying, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "That girl stole from me, assaulted my guards, and fled in the night. I demand you return her immediately so she can face proper justice." King Theron's expression was carved ice. "What did she steal?" Lord Brennan hesitated, just for a second. "Items of value, jewelry, money meant for household expenses." "That's a lie," Mara's voice rang out clearly. She descended the steps to stand beside the king, ignoring his slight frown. "I took nothing but the clothes on my back and 3 copper coins I'd earned." Lord Brennan's face purpled. "You dare speak? After what you tried to do to my daughter?" Now Mara laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "What I tried to do? Your daughter adores me. I cared for her for 2 years while you ignored her existence. The only crime I committed was refusing your advances in the nursery, while Charlotte slept 10 feet away." The Lord's guards shifted uncomfortably. This was clearly news to them. "Lies," Brennan blustered. "Slander from a desperate woman. I came here in good faith, Your Majesty, seeking justice. Instead, I find my former servant poisoning your ears with fabrications." King Theron held up one hand. The gesture was small, but it carried absolute authority. Everyone fell silent. His voice, when he spoke, was perfectly calm. "Lord Brennan, you entered my lands without invitation. You made accusations without evidence. You demanded I surrender someone under my protection." His eyes were the color of winter storms. "Do you know what I do to people who make demands of me?" The Lord swallowed. "Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect. You simply, nothing." The king descended the steps until he was level with Brennan. Up close, the height difference was dramatic. King Theron towered over the Lord, and suddenly all his carefully controlled power became visible. Brennan took an involuntary step back. Mara Ashton is employed in my household, the king continued quietly. She cares for my daughter, who has spoken more words in the past week than she has in the past 6 months. She has my protection, my respect, and my gratitude. If you have accusations, present evidence. Otherwise, leave my lands and never return. But your majesty, my reputation. Your reputation? King Theron's smile was all teeth. You just admitted before witnesses that you made advances toward your daughter's nanny. Whatever reputation you think you're protecting is already ash. Brennan's face went from purple to white. I misunderstood the situation. The girl was careful. The king's voice dropped to something dangerous. Very careful what you say next. The lord looked at his guards, at Mara, at the impassive vampire king. Whatever he saw in their faces made him step back again. This isn't over. Oh, it is, King Theron said. But before you go, know this. If you ever approach Mara again, if you send others to approach her, if you spread rumors about her character or attempt to harm her in any way, I will visit you, personally, in the night, and you will learn exactly what it means to anger a vampire king. Do we understand each other? Lord Brennan nodded frantically. He turned and fled toward his horse, his guards scrambling to follow. They clattered through the gates and disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust. Silence settled over the courtyard. Mara realized she was shaking, not from fear, but from the release of tension she'd been carrying for weeks. It's over. He's really gone. King Theron turned to her, his expression softening slightly. He's gone, and he won't return. But you should have stayed inside. Let me handle it. I couldn't hide, Mara said. It's my life, my past. I needed to face him. Brave, the king said quietly. Foolish, but brave. He started back toward the castle, then paused. Mara? Yes, your majesty. Thank you for standing beside me. You shouldn't have to face your demons alone. Neither should you, she replied. His eyes met hers, something shifting in their depths. No, I suppose not. That evening, Celeste refused to sleep. Mara had read her 3 stories, sung 2 lullabies, and sat with her in the dark nursery for an hour. But the little girl's eyes stayed stubbornly open. What's wrong, sweetheart? Mara asked gently. Bad man, Celeste whispered. The bad man came. I saw from the window. He was yelling. Mara's heart sank. Of course the child had seen. Of course she'd been frightened. He's gone, now. Your father sent him away. He won't come back. But what if he does? What if he takes you away like the other nannies left? Celeste's small hand clutched Mara's sleeve. What if everyone always leaves? Oh, Mara breathed. She gathered the little girl into her arms, holding her close. Listen to me carefully. I'm not leaving. Not because of bad men or scary things or anything else. I promised I'd stay, and I keep my promises. But the others, Celeste's voice was muffled against Mara's shoulder. They promised, too. Maybe they did, Mara admitted, and maybe they meant it when they said it. But promises are only worth something if you keep them even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The door opened softly. King Theron stood in the doorway, still in his formal clothes from confronting Lord Brennan. He took in the scene, his daughter in Mara's arms, both of them in the darkness. Is she all right? Scared, Mara said quietly. She saw what happened. Needs reassurance. The king crossed the room and sat on the edge of Celeste's bed. His large hand stroked his daughter's curls gently. Little star, he said, remember what I told you about being afraid? Celeste pulled away from Mara enough to look at her father. She nodded. Fear is just love worried about losing something, he recited. You're afraid because you love Mara, because you don't want her to leave. That's not weakness. That's your heart being smart enough to know what's precious. But Daddy, the child's voice was very small. What if I love her, and she leaves anyway? Then you'll be sad, the king said honestly. Very sad. But you'll also have had the time you spent together, and no one can take that away. And sadness means you were brave enough to love, even when you knew it might hurt. That's real courage. Mara felt her eyes burn. This vampire king, this creature of night and power, was teaching his daughter emotional intelligence with more grace than most human parents managed. I'm not planning to leave, Mara said firmly. But Celeste, even if something happened, even if I had to go away someday, it wouldn't be because I stopped caring about you. People leave for lots of reasons, and most of them have nothing to do with the people they're leaving. The nannies who left before, they weren't running from you. They were running from their own fears. The child considered this. Then she looked at her father. You're not scared? Of course I'm scared, the king admitted. Every day I'm terrified something will take you away from me, that I'll lose you like I lost your mother. But I don't let fear stop me from loving you with everything I have. Celeste reached out and touched both of them, one hand on her father's face, one on Mara's. She was building a bridge between them, Mara realized, connecting them, making them into something that felt like family. Will you both stay with me tonight? The child asked. Until I fall asleep? King Theron looked at Mara questioningly. She nodded. They settled on either side of Celeste's small bed, the vampire king, and the human nanny, keeping vigil over a frightened child. Mara sang softly, old lullabies her mother had taught her. The king hummed harmony in his deep voice, and slowly, gradually, Celeste's breathing evened out. Her small hand stayed clasped in Mara's, trusting even in sleep. When they were certain she was deeply asleep, they carefully extracted themselves and moved to the nursery sitting room. The king gestured to a pair of comfortable chairs near the window. Sit. Please. We should talk. Mara settled into the chair, suddenly aware of how informal this was. She was alone with the vampire king in the middle of the night, and instead of being frightening, it felt oddly natural. Thank you, King Theron said abruptly, for staying, for being patient with her, for standing beside me today against Brennan, for teaching her that love doesn't always end in loss. You're welcome, Mara said quietly, but you don't need to thank me. She's easy to love. Is she? His voice was wry. 7 nannies would disagree. They didn't try hard enough, Mara said firmly. They saw a difficult child and ran. They didn't see the scared, smart, wonderful little girl underneath the silence, and they certainly didn't see. She stopped herself. Didn't see what? You, Mara admitted. They didn't see a father desperately trying to reach his daughter. Didn't see someone who'd do anything to help her heal. They just saw a scary vampire king and decided it was too much trouble. The king was quiet for a long moment. Do I frighten you? Mara considered the question honestly. Sometimes. When you go very cold and still. When you look like you're carved from ice. But mostly, no. Mostly, you just seem tired and sad and trying very hard to do the right thing. His mouth twisted slightly. That's perhaps the most accurate description anyone's given of me in 3 centuries. They sat in companionable silence, watching moonlight paint silver across the nursery floor. Finally, the king spoke again. I need to tell you something. About Celeste's mother. You don't have to, Mara said quickly. That's private. No, he interrupted. You should know. You're part of this now, part of our lives. You deserve the full story. He stood and walked to the window, his back to her. Eliana, he said quietly, Her name was Eliana. She was human, like you. We met at a music festival in the city. She was playing violin in the square, and I stopped to listen. Couldn't help myself. She played for 3 hours, and I stood there the entire time, utterly captivated. Mara listened silently, letting him tell it at his own pace. When she finished playing, I introduced myself. She laughed and said she knew exactly who I was. The whole city knew the Vampire King lived in the castle on the hill. But she wasn't frightened. Said fear was boring. Curiosity was better. We talked until dawn, and when the sun started rising, she kissed my cheek and told me to visit her again. So I did. The king continued, still facing the window. Every night for a month, we'd walk through the city talking about everything, music and history and philosophy and silly things, like whether clouds had feelings and why stars looked different from her village than they did from my castle. She made me laugh. I hadn't laughed in decades, and she made it seem easy. After 6 months, I asked her to marry me. She said yes, but on one condition. She wanted a garden. Said the castle was beautiful but too solemn, needed life and color and growing things. So I built her gardens, filled them with every flower and tree she wanted. We were happy. His voice roughened, impossibly happy. When she told me she was pregnant, I was terrified. Vampire and human children are rare, often don't survive. But Eliana just held my hand and said we'd face it together. That fear couldn't stop us from loving this child already. The labor was difficult. The king turned back to face Mara, and his eyes were bright with old grief. 3 days of pain. The healers did everything they could, but her body wasn't strong enough. In the end, she had maybe 5 minutes with Celeste, held her, kissed her, told me to teach our daughter to be brave and kind. Then she was gone. Mara's throat felt tight. I'm so sorry. For a year afterward, I barely functioned. Mrs. Hendricks and the wet nurse kept Celeste alive while I drowned in grief. When I finally surfaced, my daughter was a year old and didn't know me. I'd missed her first steps, her first teeth, all of it, because I was too broken to be a father. He sat back down heavily. I tried. I've been trying for 3 years, but I'm not good at this. I'm better with strategy and politics and violence than I am with tea parties and bedtime stories. I can conquer kingdoms, but I can't seem to reach my own child. You're reaching her now, Mara said gently, because you're here. He looked at her directly. You taught her to trust again, taught her that people can stay. And somehow, in the process, you've been teaching me too. How to be gentle, how to be patient, how to be the father she needs instead of the king I've always been. I haven't taught you anything, Mara protested. You already knew all of that. You just needed permission to use it. He smiled slightly. Perhaps. Either way, I'm grateful. He paused, then added quietly, and I need to ask you something. What happens when Celeste grows too old for a nanny? When she doesn't need someone to read her stories and tuck her in? Will you leave then? Mara hadn't thought that far ahead. In the past 2 weeks, she'd been so focused on surviving each day, connecting with Celeste, building something stable. The future had seemed impossibly distant. I don't know, she admitted. What would you want me to do? Stay, the king said immediately. Not as a nanny. As, he seemed to struggle for words. As family. As someone who belongs here. There are 1,000 roles in a castle. Tutor, advisor, companion. Whatever title makes sense. But I don't want you to leave when your usefulness runs out. I want you to stay because this is your home. Mara's heart did something complicated in her chest. You're offering me a permanent place. I'm offering you whatever you want, he said quietly. Within reason. A home, a purpose, safety, respect. His eyes met hers. You've given my daughter back her voice. You've given me back hope. That's worth more than I can ever repay. She didn't know what to say. 3 weeks ago, she'd been running for her life. Now a vampire king was offering her a home. Celeste needs consistency, Mara said slowly. She needs to know I'm not going anywhere. So yes, I'll stay, as long as you'll have me. The king's expression transformed. Relief, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. Good. That's good. They fell silent again, but it was comfortable now. Warm, despite the late hour and the heavy conversation. Finally, Mara asked the question that had been nagging at her. Why did you let me in that first night? You could have turned me away. 7 nannies had abandoned you. Why trust an 8th? The king was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, because you were terrified and brave at the same time. Because you said please to a monster in the rain. Because when you looked at Celeste the next morning, your first instinct was to ask if she was okay, not to judge her silence. He met her eyes. And because I recognized something in you, the way you stood there bleeding and desperate, but still with your shoulders back, still with dignity. You'd been hurt, but you weren't broken. I thought, he smiled slightly, if she can survive whatever hell sent her here, maybe she's strong enough to help my daughter survive her own. You saw strength in me? Mara asked, surprised. I felt like I was falling apart. You were falling apart with grace, the king corrected. There's a difference. Mara thought about that. Then she said quietly, you're not a monster, you know. You keep calling yourself that, but you're not. Monsters don't build gardens for their wives, don't sing to their daughters, don't offer sanctuary to bleeding women in the rain. You're just a person who's been hurt and is trying very hard not to pass that hurt along. The king's expression flickered. After a moment, he said, Eliana used to say something similar. That I wore my cruelty like armor, but underneath I was just afraid of being hurt again. Maybe, Mara said, but you're getting better at taking the armor off, at least around people who matter. Around you, he corrected softly. Around both of you. Something hung in the air between them, unspoken and fragile. Then the king stood. It's late. You should rest. Tomorrow, Celeste wants to practice writing her letters, and she'll need your patience. Mara rose as well. Good night, Your Majesty. Theron, he said. When we're alone, you can call me Theron. She smiled. Good night, Theron. Good night, Mara. As she walked back to her room, Mara realized she was happy. Actually, genuinely happy. Not just safe or content, but filled with warmth and purpose, and the beginning of something that felt like home. 3 months passed like a dream. Celeste blossomed. She spoke in full sentences now, asked constant questions, laughed at silly jokes. She'd learned to read simple words and could write her name in careful, crooked letters. She still had bad days, moments when the fear crept back and she went quiet and small. But those moments grew rarer, and when they came, she knew how to ask for help. Mara stayed, but her role evolved. She was still Celeste's primary caretaker, but now she also helped manage the household, consulted on decisions about the estate, and somehow became the person King Theron sought out for conversation. They talked about everything, books and politics and the history of the vampire courts, his fears about raising a daughter in a dangerous world, her dreams about what life could be now that she was safe. Slowly, carefully, something grew between them that neither quite named. Mrs. Hendricks noticed, of course. Noticed the way the king's eyes followed Mara through rooms, the way Mara's face softened when Theron joined them for meals, the way they orbited each other like planets, finding their paths. It's good to see him smile again, the housekeeper said one morning while helping Mara prepare breakfast. He's been dead inside since Lady Eliana passed. You've brought him back to life." "I haven't done anything," Mara protested. "You've done everything," Mrs. Hendricks corrected. "You've made this castle a home again. Made him remember what warmth feels like. He's been in love with you for weeks now, just too stubborn or scared to admit it." Mara's hand stilled on the bread she'd been slicing. "That's not, it is," the housekeeper said firmly. "And you love him too, though you're both dancing around it like nervous children. Life's too short, dear, even for vampires. Tell him how you feel." "But what about Celeste?" Mara asked. What if you make each other happy?" Mrs. Hendricks interrupted. "That child adores both of you. Having parents who love each other would be the best gift you could give her." That evening, the castle hosted its first formal dinner in years. Theron had been convinced by his council to invite neighboring lords and ladies to re-establish diplomatic relations. Mara helped Celeste dress in a beautiful gown of silver and blue, braided her hair with ribbons, and tried not to feel nervous about meeting vampire nobility. "You look pretty," Celeste announced. She'd taken to offering compliments with the same serious consideration she applied to everything, like a princess in a story. "I'm not a princess," Mara said, smiling. "Just me." "Daddy says you're the most important person in the castle," Celeste countered. "After me. That makes you almost a princess." The logic was irrefutable. Mara laughed and kissed the top of the child's head. "Come on, we don't want to be late." The dining hall had been transformed, candles everywhere, the table laid with silver and crystal, flowers from Eliana's garden arranged in elaborate centerpieces. 30 guests filled the room, vampires in elegant clothing, their voices a low murmur of conversation. Theron stood at the head of the table, and when he saw Mara and Celeste enter, his entire expression changed, softened, warmed. He dressed formally, black coat with silver threading, his hair tied back. He looked like a king, powerful and remote. But when his eyes met Mara's, he looked like something else entirely. "My daughter," he announced to the room, and he paused almost imperceptibly. "Ward." Lady Celeste and Miss Mara Ashton. Several guests turned to study them with undisguised curiosity. Mara felt their assessment like a physical weight. She was human in a room full of vampires, a former servant wearing borrowed finery, standing beside a king. But Celeste's small hand in hers kept her steady. They took their seats near Theron. Celeste behaved beautifully, using her best manners, speaking when spoken to. Mara fielded polite questions about her role in the household, about Celeste's education, about how she found castle life. Most guests were cordial if reserved, but one lady, an elegant vampire with hair like spun gold and eyes like chips of ice, watched Mara with particular intensity. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying down the table. "Miss Ashton, you're human, yes?" "Yes, my lady," Mara confirmed. "And you care for His Majesty's daughter. How unusual. What a progressive arrangement." There was something in her tone that made the words feel less than complimentary. Theron's expression went cold. "Lady Vivian, is there something you wish to say?" The lady smiled, sharp as broken glass. "Simply that human servants typically don't dine with nobility. I'm surprised you've adopted such casual practices, Your Majesty, given your usual dedication to tradition." "Mara isn't a servant," Theron said quietly. "She's family." "Family," Lady Vivian repeated. "How extraordinary. And what does your council think of this new family arrangement?" The king's voice dropped to something dangerous. "What my council thinks is none of your concern. What happens in my castle, with my daughter, and with people under my protection is solely my decision. Are we clear?" The lady's smile didn't waver. "Crystal clear, Your Majesty." She turned her attention to her plate, but the damage was done. Conversations around the table had gone stilted, uncomfortable. Under the table, Mara felt Theron's hand find hers. A brief squeeze, there and gone, but enough to steady her. They made it through dinner, through dessert and after-dinner drinks in the parlor, through endless polite conversations and veiled assessments. When the last guest finally departed, Theron closed the doors with visible relief. He looked exhausted, all his careful control having cost him dearly. "I apologize," he said to Mara, "for Vivian's behavior. She's always been unpleasant," Mara supplied. "Cruelly perceptive," he corrected. She knew exactly what to say to cause maximum discomfort. They stood in the empty hallway, candles burning low around them. Celeste had fallen asleep on a parlor sofa and been carried to bed by Mrs. Hendricks. They were alone. "Mara," Theron said quietly, "there's something I need to say." Before she could respond, he continued. "I know our situation is complicated. You came here as a nanny, as someone seeking shelter. I gave you a position, a role to fill. But somewhere in these past months, that changed. For me, it changed." His smoke-gray eyes met hers. "You're not just Celeste's caregiver anymore. You're not just someone I employ. You're," he struggled for words, "you're the person I think about when I wake, the voice I want to hear at the end of difficult days, the face I look for in every room. And I don't know what to do with that." Mara's heart was hammering. "Theron, I know I have no right to these feelings," he continued. "You came here for safety, not to be burdened with the affections of a man 300 years older than you, a creature of night who should probably keep his distance. But I'm tired of pretending, tired of acting like you're just part of the household when you've become the center of it. Become the center of," he stopped himself. Mara stepped closer. "Say it." "Of me," he finished. "You've become the center of me." The silence stretched between them, charged and waiting. Then Mara said quietly, "Good, because you've become that for me too." His eyes widened slightly. "I have." "Did you think I stayed just for Celeste?" Mara asked. "She's wonderful, and I love her dearly. But I stayed for you too. For conversations by the fire and walks in the garden, and the way you sing lullabies when you think no one's listening. For your terrible jokes, and your patience, and the way you look at your daughter like she's the sun. For," she took a breath, "for the way you make me feel safe and seen and valued." Theron moved closer, closing the distance between them. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheek with infinite gentleness. "I don't deserve you." "Maybe not," Mara said, smiling slightly. "But you have me anyway." He kissed her then, soft and careful, as if she might break. Mara's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Eliana," he whispered. "Would she approve?" "I think," Mara said carefully, "she'd want you to be happy." She planted that willow for Celeste, built gardens so beauty would outlast her. She was thinking about the future, about life continuing. I don't think she'd want you frozen in grief forever." He pulled her close, holding her against his chest. "I loved her. Love her. Present tense, even though she's gone." "I know," Mara said, "and that's okay. Love doesn't have to be finite. You can love her memory and still have room for something new, for someone new. Is there room?" he asked quietly. "For me?" She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Theron, there's always been room for you. These past months, I've been falling in love with you one conversation at a time, one shared meal, One moment of watching you be a father. So, yes, there's room. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Mara felt something settle into place, like pieces of a puzzle finally connecting. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Theron said, "We should talk to Celeste. Make sure she's comfortable with this change." "She already knows," a small voice said from the stairway. They turned to find Celeste sitting on the steps, her nightgown ghostly in the candlelight. "How long have you been there?" Theron asked, caught between embarrassment and concern. "Long enough," the child said sagely. She stood and padded down to them on bare feet. "Are you going to get married like in the stories?" Both adults froze. Mara found her voice first. "Would you want that? If we did?" Celeste considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. Then she smiled, bright and genuine. "Yes, because then Mara would really be my family. Not just my person, but my actual family. And you'd both be happy." She yawned hugely. "Can we talk about it tomorrow?" "I'm sleepy." Theron swept her up in his arms, laughing. "Yes, little star. Tomorrow." Mara followed them up to the nursery, her heart full. As she tucked Celeste in, the child grabbed her hand. "I'm glad you stayed," Celeste whispered. "Me too," Mara whispered back. "The best decision I ever made." That night, Mara sat in her room and thought about the journey that had brought her here, running through rain, terrified and desperate, ringing a bell in the darkness, hoping for mercy, finding instead a broken family that needed her as much as she needed them. Sometimes salvation came from unexpected places. Sometimes home wasn't where you came from, but where you chose to stay. 6 months later, the castle gardens were in full bloom. Spring had transformed Eliana's careful designs into an explosion of color, every flower and tree celebrating life renewed. Mara stood on the balcony overlooking it all, wearing a simple white dress embroidered with silver stars, Celeste's design. The child had insisted on adding stars, saying her mother would want them there. The ceremony would be small, just staff and a few trusted friends. Theron had asked if she wanted something grander, a proper royal wedding. But Mara had refused. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about family, about love, about choosing each other. Mrs. Hendricks fussed with Mara's hair, weaving fresh flowers into the braids. "You look beautiful, dear, like something from a fairy tale." "I feel like something from a fairy tale," Mara admitted. "The kind where the scared girl finds her happy ending." "You made your own ending," the housekeeper corrected. "You were brave enough to ask for help, strong enough to stay when it was hard, and wise enough to recognize love when it found you. That's not fairy tale magic. That's you." A knock sounded at the door. Celeste entered, wearing a dress of pale blue that matched her eyes perfectly. She carried a bouquet of white roses from her mother's garden, carefully selected that morning. "Ready?" the child asked. "Almost," Mara said. "Are you sure you're okay with this? With me marrying your father?" Celeste crossed the room and took Mara's hand. "Daddy asked me that same question. I'll tell you what I told him. You already feel like my mother. This just makes it real. Makes it forever." Mara's eyes burned. "Oh, sweetheart." "I love you," Celeste said simply. "You stayed when everyone else left. You taught me to be brave. You made Daddy smile again. Why wouldn't I want you to be my real family?" They held each other for a moment, the child and the woman who'd become her mother, through choice rather than blood. Then Mrs. Hendricks cleared her throat. "Time, dears. His Majesty is waiting." They walked through the castle together, Celeste leading the way with her bouquet, Mrs. Hendricks following behind. Down the grand staircase, through corridors Mara had once walked as a terrified refugee, out into the gardens, where everything had begun. Theron waited under the willow tree, the same tree where they'd first begun building trust. He wore formal black, his hair loose around his shoulders, and his expression when he saw Mara was worth every moment of fear and doubt that had brought her here. Celeste ran ahead, presenting him with a single white rose from the bouquet. "This is from Mama," she announced. "For the wedding. Her garden is part of today, too." Theron took the rose with gentle hands, his eyes bright. "Thank you, little star. Your mother would be honored." Then Mara reached him, and the world narrowed to just the two of them. "You're beautiful," he said quietly. "You're biased," she replied, smiling. "Absolutely," he agreed. The ceremony was simple, ancient words spoken under spring sky, promises made with clear hearts. When Theron kissed her as his wife, Celeste cheered, and the small gathering applauded. They held a celebration afterward in the gardens, music and laughter and food. Celeste danced with both her parents, spinning in circles until she was dizzy and giggling. As sunset painted the sky gold and crimson, Theron pulled Mara aside to a quiet corner of the garden. "Happy?" he asked. "Beyond words," she replied. "You?" He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "When you rang my bell that night in the rain, I thought you were just another problem to solve, another temporary responsibility. I never imagined you'd become this." "Become what?" "Everything," he said simply. "Home and hope and happiness. You gave me back my daughter and taught me how to be myself again, how to be more than just a king playing at parenthood." "You did that yourself," Mara said. "I just helped you see what was already there." They stood in the garden Eliana had built, holding each other as stars began emerging overhead. In the distance, they could hear Celeste's laughter as Mrs. Hendricks showed her how to catch fireflies. This is what healing looks like, Mara thought. Not dramatic transformation, but quiet growth. Not erasing the past, but learning to carry it with grace. Not replacing lost love, but making room for new love to bloom alongside old memories. That night, after Celeste was tucked into bed, after the guests had departed and the candles burned low, Mara and Theron stood in their chambers together. Our chambers now, shared space, shared life. "I have something for you," Theron said. He produced a small wooden box, worn smooth with age. Mara opened it to find a silver necklace, delicate and beautiful, with a pendant shaped like a willow tree. "It was Eliana's," he said quietly. "She wore it every day. I've kept it safe, but I think she'd want you to have it. Not to replace her, but to carry her forward. To know you're part of this family's story now, past and present and future." Mara's hand shook as she lifted the necklace. "Are you sure? She gave you so much already," he said. "A daughter to love, a husband to stand beside, a home to flourish in. She planted seeds that bloomed in you. I think she'd be grateful." Theron fastened the necklace around Mara's throat. She touched the pendant gently, feeling the weight of history and blessing combined. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me, for loving me, for letting me be part of this impossible, beautiful life." "Thank you," he replied, "for ringing my bell on the worst night of your life, for being brave enough to ask for help, for staying when it would have been easier to run, for teaching both of us that family isn't just blood, it's choice." They stood together in the candlelight, two broken people who'd learned to build something whole. Outside, the gardens grew wild and beautiful, testament to love that outlasted death. Inside, a child slept peacefully, finally secure in the knowledge that her people would stay. And in that moment, in that castle built on shadows and grief, hope bloomed eternal. The poor nanny who'd begged the vampire king for sanctuary had become a queen. Not because of crowns or ceremonies, but because she'd chosen to stay, to love, to believe in the possibility of home. And the vampire king who'd forgotten how to be human learned that healing begins the moment you let someone see your wounds. That family is built on consistency, kindness, and the courage to try again even after loss. Years later, when Celeste would tell her own children about how her parents met, she'd begin with rain and desperation and a bell ringing in darkness. She'd tell them about a woman brave enough to ask for help, and a father who learned that strength includes gentleness. But mostly, she'd tell them that love isn't a lightning strike. It's a garden planted with intention, tended with care, and given time to grow. And in that garden, under a willow tree planted by the first mother she never knew, beside the second mother who chose her daily, Celeste learned the most important lesson of all, that family is anyone who stays, who chooses you, who makes you feel seen. And those people, whoever they are, wherever they come from, are worth more than all the kingdoms in the world.